Hello, my dear viewers. Imagine with me for a moment that you are a seagull. Seagull flying over the Mediterranean Sea to the east, until you reach a point on the coast between Tel Aviv and Haifa. There you will find a charming and beautiful place known today as Dor. An ideal resort no less wonderful than the beaches of Greece, Cyprus, and Sicily. Soft sand, nice atmosphere, and coral reefs. Greenery around and beyond the beach. A museum and some archaeological sites that date back to the Bronze Age. And many houses that if you see them, you feel that they came from Florida and were stationed here. Of course, there are many resorts around with various services and facilities. Since you're still a seagull who knows nothing about the place, you'll see a modern resort from the sky, called Nashalem. A few meters away from it, there's a small building, of a style different from that of the surrounding place. And it doesn't really fit in with the harmony of it. A house built in an old Arab style standing in the heart of many Western and modern style buildings. In 1991, a resident of that place decided to build a diving center next to this house. And indeed, workers and equipment arrived at the location and the drilling began. But they suddenly stopped, as they found the remains of human bones buried at a shallow depth. So, they closed everything up, left and never came back again. This was seen by a fisherman named Fawad Hasadaya, who lives in the nearby Arab village of Al-Faratis. When he went to the project owner and asked him why they left, the project manager told him, "We found bones and remains from Napoleon's age." But Fawad says, "No. These are the remains of Palestinians who were killed in 1948 and were buried there." His father and grandfather told him about the massacre committed by Israeli soldiers in this place, and that the dead were buried in mass graves. One of these graves lies beneath the parking lot of that Nashalem resort. All of this happened before the resort was built, and before the place was even renamed as Dor. It happened when it was a Palestinian fishing village called Tantura. Tantura was a small Palestinian village, located at the south of Haifa on the map. Until 1948, its population was about 1,500 Palestinians, who depended on fishing and farming. It was a very quiet, very small, and very, very beautiful village. After the Nakba and for 50 years, until approximately the year 2000, nothing was said about Tantura, in Israel, other than being a village that witnessed a battle in the War of Independence between the Israelis and Arabs. And the Israelis won, and the Arabs immigrated from the village and went to the nearby village of Al-Faratis. And then the settlers established Kibbutz Nashalem there. That remained the situation until 1998, when an Israeli student at the University of Haifa published his master's thesis. This student was called Teddy Katz. While preparing his research, he met a number of old soldiers from a military brigade of the Israeli army called the Alexandroni Brigade. They were the ones responsible for entering Tantura on May 22, 1948. With their testimonies, Katz discovered that the battle was not actually a real battle. It wasn't a battle between two armies or two armed parties, because despite the villagers' attempts to resist, they were poorly armed and had little experience in fighting. So the battle ended before it even started. The family's surrender after their defeat wasn't an escape from death. It was, in fact, the beginning of a massacre. On the night of May 22nd and the morning of the 23rd, Israeli soldiers invaded the village of Tantura. At first, they separated men and women. Women were stripped of their money, gold, and anything of value. They were expelled from the village, wandering in the unknown with no place to go. As for the village's men, the soldiers gathered them on the beach, near the Arab house. Don't think this only applied to real grown-up men. But any boy who looked over 13 years old was considered an adult man by the Arab house, the witness of these events. Execution began. The testimonies that Teddy Katz heard from the soldiers were terrifying, and were later shown combined in a movie called Tantura, by an Israeli director named Alon Swartz. One of the soldiers said they placed individuals in barrels and shot them, and that he still remembers how the blood looked in these barrels. Someone else said, a soldier who would become a prominent figure in the defense ministry took out his pistol and started killing the hostages by the beach, one after another. A third soldier named Amitzer Cohen said literally while laughing, "I was a murderer. I didn't take prisoners. How many do you think he killed?" Actually, he doesn't know and neither do we. He says while laughing, "I didn't count. I had a machine gun with 250 bullets, and I finished and reloaded. I can't say how many." What I am telling you is not the testimonies of the victims, but those of the killers. These are the ones who are supposed to try and tone down the severity of their actions. Imagine that it's this horrific after being toned down. The victims' testimonies are far more horrific than this. You can read them in detail in the sources. Most of the victims were displaced as refugees in camps, some in Syria, and some still live today in the village of Al-Faradis. They lived in a village a few kilometers away from where they lived, and their families were killed and buried. They don't even know where they're buried, it's all just guesses. Until May 2023, a research agency called Forensic Architecture published the results of an investigation conducted to answer this question. Where were these people buried? They brought airshot photographs of the Tantura village between the years 1946 and 1949. Pictures before and after the massacre. They did an analysis of these images and compared it with current maps of the place and recent satellite images. They did 3D modeling of the changes that occurred, and also collected testimonies from people who survived the massacre. They produced a report that accurately identifies the locations of mass graves. The largest two of them, one is located next to the cemeteries of the old village, and the second one is located under the parking lot serving a beach and resort. If you go to Google now and search for these places, the first thing you will encounter is hotel reservations and places for activities. That is all despite the fact that all of this is built literally on top of execution fields and mass graves, as if Tantura is a metaphor for all of Israel, which is a very thin and fragile layer of Western urbanization. And only meter below that fragile layer is evidence of killing, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. My dear, everything I told you so far is from Israeli sources. Not Western but Israeli. The Arab sources contain much uglier details. But I have a reason for choosing these sources. I want to showcase some examples for the few Israeli voices. Voices that tried to dig into the roots of the Nakba and tell you what happened to them on the hands of the only democracy in the Middle East. These people were silenced. Teddy Katz, for example, who held interviews with soldiers, had a defamation case raised against him by war criminals. His master's thesis was withdrawn from the university library. He was forced to retract everything he said. And his academic career was completely destroyed. Eyal Weizman, who founded forensic architecture, that you saw their picture a while ago, he faced a lighter punishment. He had his books banned in Israel, especially Hollow Land, because this book is considered a book of conviction. He explains the Israeli occupation's method in building settlements in a way that strangles and expels Palestinians. These aren't individual cases. There are many examples of those who tried talking about Nakba in Israel and how they were silenced. So much so that in 2011, the Knesset approved a law known by the Nakba law, granting the right to the Ministry of Finance to suspend government funding and official support from any institution that talks about the Nakba, meaning in a university or a research institution. If a professor there will give a lecture about the Nakba, the government has the right to suspend its support and funding for the university. Because of this law, many books weren't published, many articles weren't issued, films weren't shot, and so on. This is all to ensure that no one messes with the made-up narrative that Israel is trying so hard to tell about itself, especially if that person is Jewish and not Zionist. This is strange to them, to the point that these anti-Zionist Jews, self-hating Jews, a humiliating name. One of the most popular self-hating Jew is Elon Papp, who was basically expelled from the University of Haifa, also the author of 10 Myths About Israel. These are the fictional legend Israel is feeding to the world, especially the West. Founding myths. The narrative that Israel tells about itself. The national narrative dictated to children in schools can be seen in two ways, either a bunch of lies and stop there, or as a bunch of lies that we need to understand to know why the world believes them so bad. This myth-like narrative begins with the Jewish kingdoms on the land of Palestine. That fell apart and the Temple of Solomon was destroyed along with it. And since 70 AD, Jews were dispersed throughout the world. And for 2,000 years, they were subjected to discrimination and oppression. That peaked at the Holocaust. As a survival attempt, the remaining Jews decided to escape and return to the land of ancestors. That's the first part of the narrative, where Israel presents itself in the weak moment of birth, earning sympathy, making it easier for people to buy their story later on. The rest of the story can be seen in the 6th grade geography book in Israeli schools, describing the return of the brave settler, Jews who bought the land and built it by using all and every means of modern technology. If I stopped here, that's not enough. I need to add more details to paint the perfect picture in your mind. So we'd see the book saying that the settlers arrived and found a land of ruins and swamps. So they began digging wells to provide fresh water and using fertilizers so that the land could be farmed, developed technologies, and cleared the swamps and filled them in. So they were able to eliminate the malaria that was killing them. They also established cities like Tel Aviv, the first port in the region, adding in the detail that the sea there in Tel Aviv is shallow with little depth. So it was hard to build a port. But the settlers succeeded. If you think about with me, you'd see this part is meant to entice admiration and paint a picture of the weak people who once sought a chance. They succeeded in a way that reminds us of the white settler who arrived at North America to build the United States of America. Until this part of the story, they achieved two things: sympathy and admiration. Any story needs an important element, a conflict. And the conflict needs a villain. The first villain in the Israel story, surprisingly, is the British Mandate. That's not a typical villain, but one who hinders the Jews' migrations and tries to abort their dream in building a state. Imagine a villain who's trying to stop Jews from escaping death in Europe and resorting to the safety of their new home. So in turn, you as someone listening to the story will hate that villain. And you're waiting for the moment when the hero will defeat the villain. The Israeli fictional narrative gives you multiple heroes, not just one. Heroes like Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Rabin, Ariel Sharon, and Shimon Peres, who joined military organizations such as Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi. If you focused, you'll see these names smartly chosen. Lehi meant fighters for the freedom of Israel. So I'm giving you a story with an organization called Freedom Fighters. Of course you'll sympathize with me and believe the Jewish bravery and sacrifice that succeeded in forcing Britain out of the land. And you'll also be happy for me that with Britain's exit, it'd be an independence from mandate, and the Jews' freedom from historical diaspora. You'll also be happy for me when the UN announces Resolution 181. In November 1947, that partitioned Palestine into an Arab state and a Jewish state. All what I said now, my friend, you know it's a big fat lie. But what I'm trying to crystallize is that it's a well-made big lie. That's highly believable. Imagine saying all this to someone who knows nothing. Then after all this, tell him that on May 14, 1948, Israel became a country with a prime minister called David Ben-Gurion. And then tell him that only one day after the state is formed, a second villain attacked that dream. It feels like an American film's plot. Whereas the hero just won after defeating the first villain. And the film is almost over, a second villain appears. Whoever's watching the film will never believe that this second villain isn't actually a villain. The second villain was us. According to Israel's fictional narrative, one day after announcing their state, 7 Arab armies decided to unite and attack this newborn state to exterminate the Jews. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, KSA, Iraq, and forces from Palestine. All those are up against just one. Does the story stop there? No. The Israeli narrative continues with a story from the Israelites. The story of David and Goliath. David, the young weak man, who one day will fight the giant Goliath, the strong and mighty. And for David's faith and courage, he'll defeat Goliath. In this story, Israel is David, and the 7 Arab armies are Goliath. When I put the story in that context, who'd you sympathize with? You'll also believe me when I tell you something even more vulgar. When I tell you that the Palestinian Arabs left their lands to give the chance to the 7 armies to kill the Jews. And you'll believe me when I tell you that Israel tried its very best in all ways to convince Palestinians to return to their lands, but they refused and preferred to live as refugees. This is a story that tries to convince me that there are people who refused returning to their lands. It's hard to believe, but they know how to tell the story well. So apparently some people do believe it. Some people even still believe to this day that Israel is doing nothing but trying to make peace with its neighbors that hate it. The story ends with stating that Israel's only dream is peace, but at the same time always ready to defend itself. As a proof of that, its army is called the Defense Army. And definitely after the epic I just told you. When I say that the IDF is the most noble army, you'll believe me. This is an entirely fake story, my friend. filled with tons of lies and half-truths. But it shows Israel as the underdog. And apparently that's what made it easy to sympathize with. I know that the story is as fake as it gets, and you know it too. But apparently the average white citizen, with little to no knowledge of the world around him, and only lives for the iced coffee, like Abad Ta said, the best press reporter in the world. It appears so that this citizen doesn't know that it's fake. Because for many decades, Israel invested in invading the Western mind with this story, in a way that assures the burial of the real story beneath. I'm here today to tell you about the real story. The Nakba. First myth: one people. My friend, the first myths is that there's something called the Jews. All of them as an entity since the beginning of history. One people, one race, same hopes. Oppressed for 2,000 years. Not individuals, but one entity. While if we took a look at Jewish communities in Europe, and compare them to Jewish communities in Arab countries by the end of the 19th century, a quick look will tell us that this isn't real. Jews in Morocco, for example, were 150,000. In Egypt, 80,000. By the beginning of the 20th century, Jews in Baghdad, Iraq were 50,000. That's 25% of Baghdad's population. These Jewish communities were part of the Arab countries they lived in. Jewish Arabs whose life and properties were safe. They have their own schools and worship places. There's no doubt they faced issues faced by any minority. But they were a part of our society's fiber. All these countries belonged to the Ottoman Empire. That was tolerant with the Jews there. On the other side, in Europe, Jews faced a different reality. A reality created by the changed Europe was going under at the time. If we looked at Europe's map in the beginning of the 19th century, Europe was changing from grand empires into nation-states. These empires spread over huge lands, containing different people, races, and religions. Kings take heirs from each other, while the minorities are second-degree citizens. Sometimes with good conditions and other times not. Jewish communities in European empires were a minority, a self-enclosed minority, living in what's called ghettos. Their communication with the outer world was limited. They saw themselves as different. But the new idea of the nation-states that replaced empires changed that situation. Germany turned from a few scattered small kingdoms into a unified German state. Same goes for Italy and Poland. I'm confused, ABO honed, what's the difference between them? Just the names, never mind. Dr. Fawzi El-Bedoui, professor of Jewish studies in University de la Manuba, says that nation-states offered a promise of a new reality. No more minorities or majorities, just citizens. We're all German, or Italian, or Polish. We all have an identity that binds us, which is the nation. Even if we have differences in religion or race, we're all citizens and integrated in one nation. The Jewish reaction to this ideology was different. Some of the Jewish communities refused the idea. They saw that the one way they can still be Jews, and not to integrate and forget their history, is to isolate themselves and refuse this new reality, and differentiate themselves from the new identities formed. This fear was moved by the violence that many European Jewish communities faced, especially in Russia and Poland. So much so that the name pogrom appeared, which is a Russian word meaning killing the Jews, destroying their properties, and burning their houses. On the other hand, some other European Jewish communities saw that this violence was temporary and would disappear over time. and that integration is the solution. They saw a chance to learn and benefit from the modern fast-changing European knowledge, and melting into the society when they get modern jobs. Doctors, poets, and bank clerks. They believe their culture won't vanish, because religion and language will preserve their culture. In both cases, whether those in favor or opposed this new reality saw themselves as European citizens in European countries. All what I said denies the existence of a separate entity called Jews. At the end of it all, Jews are individuals and communities, with their conditions changing from best to worst or vice versa, according to the historical age and geographical place they lived in. The Zionist ideology is trying to do the opposite, to picture Jews as a unique condition in history, and that aggression against them is fixed and fateful. So much so that a Zionist thinker called Leon Pinker says about anti-Semitism that it's a 2,000 years old genetic disease and infection. Second myth: Zionism is Judaism. The anti-Zionism Israeli historian Elon Papp said that the worst thing Zionism did was manipulating Judaism to use religion as a justification for implementing an originally colonial ideology. ABO Holmes, please, break it down, I don't get it. I know you like stories. You want a story with a conflict and a villain, right? I told you a while ago, some Jews accepted integration, and others didn't. From those who accepted integration was an Austrian journalist called Theodor Herzl. He grew up in a very rich Jewish family. Well educated with German education, only knows the word shalom in Hebrew. His relationship with religion is almost non-existent. Some people say he was on the verge of atheism. Wait, ABO Holmes, Herzl, the father of Zionism and Israel, had a non-existent relationship with religion and wanted to integrate in Europe? That's the dramatic plot. It's the coming-of-age genre. In 1894, Herzl went to Paris to cover an important case for a Jewish French officer called Alfred Dreyfus. This man was accused of leaking classified information to the Germans. This case had shaken France. The people divided, some advocated for his innocence, while others accuse him of treason. Till here everything is okay, a case in a court with some slogans. All news. But what wasn't normal, that some demonstration against Dreyfus were cheering with "Death to the Jews." That's where again? In Paris. The beating heart of modernism. It's true that some sources say Herzl over-exaggerated, and that the cheer was death to the traitor. But what's sure is that in both cases, Herzl saw this as a turning point. This made him lose his faith in integrating in societies. So he was now prone to isolation. Honestly, he let go of the whole integration versus isolation ordeal. He went to a third option that wasn't known at the time, nor had an audience in the Jewish European communities. An idea called Zionism. So Jews weren't Zionists to begin with? Nope. Zionism is an ideology that appeared in the 16th century. It appeared between Christians and especially Protestants, and even more precisely in Britain. The idea is simply that Jews go to Jerusalem and build the temple in preparation for the second coming of Jesus. The idea stayed the same until the 19th century. A normal idea that exists and no one cares for. Jews used to hear this and not give it much thought. You don't want us to be citizens, and want us to leave, so you can be citizens alone? We get it all. Jewish Zionism in the 19th century, however, was different than this. Especially Herzl's Zionism. It wasn't as simple as taking Jews back to Jerusalem. The Egyptian writer Al-Sayyid Yassin, in his book Dissecting Israeli Mind, he tries to give us a clearer and more detailed picture on the Jewish Zionism. The Jewish Zionism is a racist ideology. It sees that all humans everywhere in all times have deep hatred for Jews. If you get a 4-year-old who just learned how to talk and asked him if he loves Jews, he'll say yes, no biggie. Jewish Zionism says he's just saying that, but deep inside he doesn't. Zionism opposes the other who's not Jewish and sees that this hatred is deep inside him for no other reason other than he's not Jewish. So the only solution for Jews to be safe, to create a state purely for them without the others. All Jews. No integration or isolation or communication, a state for only them. No one lives with them. Or at least they'd be the vast majority that rules. This ideology will be documented by Herzl in his book The Jewish State. Abo Holmed, now who exactly are the Jews? I don't have an answer to this question, but I can tell you the Zionist definition of it. The Zionist definition is that Jews are one pure race, from the beginning of times till the last of it, and that they don't just represent a religion. Judaism isn't a proselyte religion. They don't seek inviting others to their faith, or marry inside their faith. So Zionism sees Jews as a pure people or race, which is also a racist ideology. Not just that, but according to the researcher Beatty Amin, she says that one of the Zionist principles, that Jews are only oppressed by others, but there could never be a Jew who oppresses another Jew. Remember the thing about the self-hating Jew? Zionism gets shaky when a Jewish criticizes it. In short, Zionism is based on a belief that the whole world hates Jews, that the entire world is anti-Semitic, and those who aren't are prone to. Herzl saw that oppression, hatred, and anti-Semitism were the power that will lead Jews to the solution, and in his words, "We are one people, our enemies have made us one." I find this idea a little scary, my friend. That the unification of some people is based on the hatred of others towards them. So you're defined by the people who hate you. Indeed, without anti-Semitism, Zionism wouldn't have existed. Can you imagine that there's an ideology that's based on people rejecting it? And once everyone accepts it, it'll fall apart. Herzl saw that anti-Semitism would be the power that had enabled the Jews to build their state. In short, after all this, Zionism was an idea that reacted to discrimination against Jews, with discrimination against everything that's not Jewish. So the solution is for Jews to live in a state by themselves. Herzl kept thinking, where would this state be? There were suggestions like Argentina, Uganda, Madagascar, Russia. Because like I told you, it had nothing to do with religion. All what mattered was to establish a state for protection from the hatred of Jewish that's deep within the non-Jewish. Let me tell you a surprise, that most Jewish communities, whom Herzl suggested to the Zionism and state solution, they didn't bat it that much attention. You go and we'll come later. Those were the oppressed themselves. They were questioning why immigrate from the places they had been living in, rather than demanding their rights. Even if we immigrate, we will emigrate to the New World. America, it was already the first destination for European Jews, transforming New York in the late 19th century to the most important Jewish city in the world. The first Zionist Congress was set to be held in Munich. But interestingly enough, the German Jewish refused. So much so that many Hakems saw Zionism a challenge against the divine fate of diaspora for the Jews. That's when Herzl thought of the idea we spoke about earlier, which is, to convince all these people I need. A really nice story, even if it's not real. I need a legend for people to believe in. In her book, A Short History of Myth, Karen Armstrong says that a myth is true because it's effective, not because it's fact. Herzl understood that Europeans were afraid of traveling to a place they did not know. What would we do in Uganda? Too hot. What would we do in Russia? Too cold. Imagine being oppressed and also cold. But what if the destination was known, guaranteed, and holy? A happy ending to a sad story. This was the only way he managed to convince them. We won't immigrate to a new place, we'll go back home. At that time, in the First Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, the Zionist movement announced its destination, Palestine. According to the Argentinian sociologist, Pedro Bridger, Herzl turned the biblical idea of diaspora, this epic story, into a modern ownership document to own Palestine. For the immigration to be seen as not a political solution, but a religious duty. That's when the mix-up started between Zionism and Judaism. That's what created the fallacy that Judaism equals Zionism. And that anti-Zionism is the same as anti-Judaism. Third myth: a land without people. A land without people is the most famous Zionist ideas. That's despite the fact that Palestine during late 19th and early 20th centuries was a fully integrated society with Muslim majority, Christians, and Jewish minority. A society, despite its religious diversity, still was culturally homogeneous. Jaffa, the biggest city on the East Coast, had more than 60,000 Palestinians. It had cinemas, theaters, and a port that was hundreds of years older than Tel Aviv's new port. The British delegate that came to Palestine between 1871 and 1877 wrote about Palestine an encyclopedia of 12 parts, where it wrote the names of 13,000 places. This leaves us with two possibilities for the sentence "land without people." The first possible meaning is interpreted by Pedro Bridger, that the leaders of the Zionist movements demanding going to the Promised Land, the Holy Land where their dreams would come true, they knew nothing about, because to them the world was just Europe. The only information they knew about Palestine were from adventurers and travelers. If you're a traveler, you won't go tell people in Europe about being in Jaffa and seeing things we have like cinemas or theaters. It's not exotic enough. You've been to the East. Paint them a picture of the primitive East, with tents, camels, and the 1,000 Nights and One Night stories, and an empty land that awaits the return of the Jews. This is the first interpretation for land without people. The second interpretation is proposed by the Palestinian historian, Salman Abu Senna, who said that a land without people was the Zionist intention. To get the land to be without people, and let me explain. Until the end of 19th century, the percentage of immigrants did not exceed 3%. That was at the time under the Ottoman rule. Herzl's attempts to get the Ottoman Sultan to specify a land for the Jews. The Sultan refused but left the immigration going, because Ottomans and Arabs didn't have a problem with Jews for being Jews. If you're a Jew and want to live with us in peace, our pleasure. But if you're a Zionist, the immigration continued, and in 1907 the Zionist Chaim Weizmann established a land development company in Jaffa. Chaim Weizmann is an extremely important character in the Zionist history. A Jewish whose relationship with religion is almost non-existent. What's with all the non-God-fearing people ABO homed? This company's goal was to purchase land in an organized manner from Palestinians. But according to the American professor Walter Lane, in a farming society like this, landlords refused to give up their land for money, because it was the base of their lives and livelihood. Especially the deal conditioning expelling Arab farmers from the land, to make it a land without people, so we can get our own people. That's why the Zionists will only succeed in purchasing lands from so-called people who own many land but don't live there. Like one of the Lebanese families living in Europe, who sold 200 square kilometers in Marj ibn Amr to Jewish entities. Till this point, it seems innocent. Jews immigrating from Europe to live and farm in a new place. But the structure of the farms they built didn't really insinuate this. What the Zionists did since the beginning, and continued doing with every land they took, was to refuse Palestinian workers on the land. You're not there to work with them, you're there to replace them. Remember, a land without people. So this means all workers have to be Jewish. To the point where Marj ibn Amr witnessed the displacement of 60,000 Palestinians, and were replaced by immigrant Jews. The second thing was land guards. Jewish security troops were formed called Has-Homer. Its goal was to protect these lands, because they always thought about anything outside this land as an enemy. This guard strengthened relations between Jews and the new land. The third condition was boycotting. We'll economically boycott Palestinians. I'm not here to make business with him. I'm here to make Jewish products and work with Jews. This way of handling the land was a Zionist strategy. It probably wasn't as clear at that time, but it hasn't changed much since the beginning of the 20th century. Although this strategy wasn't so clear at the beginning, it aroused concern with some Palestinians. It started appearing in some newspapers like Al-Carmel issued in 1909. That publicly warned against the Jewish settlement movement. But the immigrations continued. Before World War I, the number of Jews in Palestine increased from 24,000 to 50,000. The number was doubled, but still not enough. This made the Zionist settler movement feel it'd take them 100 years. What would we do with 50K? We need to pace things up. Like anyone wants to build his project, we need an investor. And who was the perfect candidate? Britain. Fourth myth: Britain the enemy. In the normal fictional Israeli narrative, Britain is an enemy that tries to hinder establishing the Israeli state. While if you look at history, you'll see it's exactly the opposite. And that without Britain, the Zionist project wouldn't have worked. Until before World War I in 1914. And years after the immigration of European Jews to Palestinians. Their number didn't exceed 50,000. While the Palestinians was 500,000. Like I told you, in the Zionist belief, if the Jews are a minority anywhere, they'll be oppressed. We'd escape from being a minority in Europe to be a minority in a new land. That's when Chaim Weizmann makes a move and leans into the UK. Don't you want to help us leave you and go to Palestine? We're all Europeans. We'll be your arms and legs there, for your interests in the region. The truth is, Britain did agree. It helped Zionism and eased the Jewish immigrations into Palestine. One would ask, why Britain would so willingly offer help? That question is a shame. If you focused in the episodes, you wouldn't have asked. I'll tell you, Britain in World War I fought Germany. And who's Germany's ally? The Ottoman Sultan's empire. It was falling apart at that time. Was it poorly? No, like really collapse. Britain as a colonial power in its prime had its eyes on some Ottoman states. Or actually, many states. One of these states was Palestine. Britain had intense fear that Germany enters Palestine during war. Hence it would be close to the Suez Canal, which for Britain represents its route to its colonies in India. You want to be as close to Palestine and Suez Canal. So you'd close it up and deny my access to my colonies in India? Of course not. Not just that, Palestine's geographical location is close to Mediterranean and Red Seas, and between the two important Arab capitals at the time, Cairo and Damascus. So if you as Britain laid your hands on it, and allow some European settlers there, they'll be loyal to you because you helped them. Here, the Jewish Zionism found its interest with Britain's colonial dreams. Damn colonialism. In 1915, the British Zionist minister, Herbert Samuel, submitted a secret document to the Parliament, titled The Future of Palestine, where he says that the idea of establishing a state for Jews in Palestine is perfect, but it can't be done without a full British mandate over the land. This mandate would ease the immigration and increases Jews to 4 million Jews. Then in 1917, this suggestive document turned into British declaration, known as the Balfour Declaration. A letter wrote by the British Exterior Minister, Arthur Balfour, who was a Zionist anti-Semitic Christian. What? How abo honed? I just told you. There's no Zionism without anti-Semitism. Again? Again. The Zionist idea owe it to the anti-Semitic idea. Anyway, the Balfour Declaration promised establishing a national state for Jews. But there's a trick here. What's a national state for Jews? Does it mean that Europe's Jews would live in Palestine, which is under the British mandate? Or does it mean establishing an actual Jewish state, with only Jewish population and ruled by them? What this exactly meant wasn't even clear to the English themselves. But at that time no one cared enough to clarify. Britain continued its plan to support Jews' immigration. In the same year, the British General Allen By will enter Jerusalem. He entered Jerusalem with a Jewish military corps. And with this crops a man called David Ben-Gurion. You may think that they went in like a hot knife through butter, but no. In 1918, Jews were about 50,000 while Palestinians were around 500,000. 85% of these Palestinians rejected the idea of a Jewish state. In fact, a committee sent by U.S. President Wilson to examine the situation said that in order to achieve Mr. Balfour's declaration, it will require a military force of 50,000 soldiers. However, despite all that, Britain didn't give up. And they continued their plan, especially as World War I ended with Britain's victory against the Ottoman Empire. In 1920, the League of Nations granted Britain, which is the UN before updating, the mandate over Palestine. That's when Britain appoints Herbert Samuel as the first High Commissioner. This guy made everything so easy. From 1919 to 1921, the Jewish migrations would greatly increase, where 185,000 Jewish immigrants arrived, while the Jewish National Fund bought 240,000 acres from Jezreel Valley northern of Palestine, with the idea of settlement turning into a full-scale European project. Violent demonstrations spread across Palestine, starting from Jaffa, where 95 Jewish and 64 Arabs died. Then Churchill announced in June 1922, the Churchill White Paper, This white paper by Churchill says, "Why are you worried, guys? Don't be so angry. I see no reason for you to be worried. Now you know why we were worried. Let me tell you that some sources say that Churchill was also anti-Semitic. So, Churchill tried to calm the Arabs down and tell them, guys, the Jews won't occupy Palestine. They will just create a society in it with what works for the nature of the country, its economy, and its population. Don't misjudge them." The truth is that the reality and future will beg to differ with Churchill. Jews were creating closed communities, ones that didn't blend with Palestinians, but were made to replace them, to the point that some Jewish towns were granted local autonomy like Tel Aviv, which developed separate ministries of works, energy, and water, education in a different language, and universities like the Hebrew University, which Balfour himself attended its opening. Things will stay that way for a while, until in 1929, when immigrant numbers started to double. Not only that, but in 1929, a Jewish prayer was organized in Jerusalem calling for the revival of the temple, and claims their historical right in the Wailing Wall, which is the Burak Wall in Islam, and the Jewish day of mourning the temple's destruction, aligned with the Muslim Mawlid. So Palestinians got angry. That's the revolution we know as Burak Uprising in 1929. That's when Palestinians were surprised by the violent oppression led by the British. They didn't only arrest hundreds of rebels. They executed the revolution leaders. The British treated Palestinians as if they were the Red Indians, or the Black Australians. These are British colonizer terms, given by the British to who they deem as barbaric people. Meanwhile, the immigrant Jews are not that. They are civilized white Europeans. White on the outside, white on the inside. The Israeli historian Elon Papp says that the people of Palestine were described in the letters between Balfour, Churchill, and Herbert Samuel, using words like Arabs or Mohammedans. The word Arab at the time wasn't like the one we know now. At the time, Arab meant nomadic or primitive. The picture of camels and tents. And Mohammedans didn't mean Muslims. It meant the followers of Muhammad. Last time I heard followers of Muhammad was in the Far al-Islam movie. But seriously, these letters reflect a point of view where the white colonizers see Palestinians as a part of primitive groups who don't have an identity or privacy, as if they were primitive tribes that unfortunately happen to be living there. Winston Churchill will later bluntly say, "To explain, my friend, since I didn't know what a manger was. This means that a dog being in a farmhouse, or a barn, doesn't give him the right to own the barn, even if he has been there for a while." Do you know who he meant by that? He meant the natives of America, Australia, and Palestine. But who has the right to rule these lands according to Churchill? The civilized Europeans, whether they are British or Jewish. And according to that, the Jewish immigrations continue until they reach 27% of the population in 1935. From 3% to 27%. And revolutions against them never stopped. Revolutions against the unfair British colonization. And one of the major revolutionists was a Syrian guy from Al-Azhar University, who turned from a preacher at the Istiqlal Mosque in Haifa to a leader of an armed movement against the British. His name is Izz-al-Din al-Qassam. He was joined by many volunteers who gave him ammunition and weapons. But the occupation succeeded in killing Izz-al-Din al-Qassam in an unfair battle. Al-Qassam's funeral will turn into the heart of the people's movement. This movement turned later into a complete revolt. From April to October of 1936. It was the spark of the Great Arab Revolt. The British were disoriented by the revolt. They probably were surprised that the dog in the manger was resisting. Between 1936 and 1937, the British killed 1,000 Palestinian and arrested anyone who took part in the revolution. And then they would blow up his home and destroy it. In Jaffa only, more than 200 houses were demolished. Britain gave the Jewish settlers everything, my friend. They made immigrations easier, created areas with tight Jewish communities, with organizations and infrastructures, fought Palestinian revolutions and killed their leaders, and continued the oppression to the point that 10% of Palestinian men in 1940, 10%, were either killed, exiled, or arrested. In addition, Britain planted racist ideas against the natives of the occupied land. The British taught Jews all the bad things. But there was one thing left. They gave them cigarettes, abo honed. The thing that the Jews would learn from the British was the whole colonization thing. It's nice. Why not? And indeed, the Zionist colonial ambition increases. The other thing that the British helped the Zionists in was developing the necessary military force to achieve that ambition. In 1937, a commission was created called the Peel Commission. They would suggest dividing the land between 1 million Arabs and 400,000 Jews. 1/3 for the Jews and 2/3 for the Arabs. The thing is that Palestinians were literally everywhere. So, they would be a majority even in the Jewish areas. Churchill in front of that committee would call Palestinians dogs in a manger. We can kick them out. Britain didn't go through with the committee's suggestion. They wanted to, but they backed down. However, the professor of history at Oxford University, Eugene Rogan, says that the Peel Commission were the first to suggest the idea of expulsion. You shouldn't just buy lands and create closed communities. You should force the people out of their land and create religiously and ethnically unified places for other people. Do you think it stops here? The colonial ambition of the Zionist movement was increasing. Ben-Gurion and the Zionist leaders sat down and thought. To be honest, the expulsion idea was nice. How about instead of forcing them out of the third of Palestine, we forced them out of Palestine entirely? Later on, the director of the Jewish agency, Joseph Weitz, said, and you should listen carefully, there will be no land for two peoples. The settlers' ambitions grew so far past the British themselves. The second thing that the Jewish settlers learned from the British was the necessary violent power needed to achieve that ambition. It happened all gradually. From 1937 to 1939, the Jews would, and hear this, they would do exceptional terrorist acts. You mean that in an exaggerated way, right, abo honed? I mean it in a literal way, my friend. Like the terrorism we hear about on TV. They sent car bombs to Haifa and Jerusalem markets. That killed more than 70 Palestinians. All that was under the supervision of the British. Again, please go look at the sources. I'm not saying all that because I'm an Arab, or a nationalist, or for my people. Please look at the sources. Because this episode specifically was made with Israeli sources. Anyway, you know what Britain did while watching all that happen? They increased the number of soldiers in Palestine to 25,000 soldiers. They killed 5,000 Palestinians and arrested another 9,000. in conditions described by Eugene Rogan as concentration camps. However, despite all that British spoiling, Britain was just like any other empire. It won't be there forever. For the Jews to protect their interests, they had to have an independent army, to avoid having their fate linked to Britain forever. Especially because a conflict of interests started to happen. Because with the start of World War II in 1939, Britain, hear this out, would limit the Jewish immigrations to Palestine. Shame on them. And they put the limit of 15,000 immigrant yearly, to try and lessen the tensions in the Arab region, to be able to focus on their war with Hitler. World War II is happening, where there was a real oppression happening for the Jews in Europe. You might think that this moment created a conflict between the parties. But with the beginning of the war, 15,000 Jewish soldiers join the English army and participate in the World War. I'm telling you this information because that's where they gain great experience. You join the Champions League. You are training with the British Army against German machines. You have experience now. Later on, the Jewish militia groups that did terrorist acts would slowly turn into organized military structures, such as the most famous one I told you about before, Haganah, and other groups like Stern and Ergen. The Haganah would transform from a gang to an army that owns an air force. According to the historian Elon Papp, the Zionist movement with an organized military force will start to ask themselves, why do expulsion when they can eliminate? Why expel Arabs? Let's exterminate them. Palestinians have proved that they don't stop revolting or fighting wars. Even if we kick them out, they will come back. Sorry, but this land is just for us. For Jews only. That's why while the British Army was fighting systematically, the Jewish gangs were training on a different kind of war. The British General Ord Wingate was the first person to train Jews on the occupation of villages and on something called the internal wars. According to Elon Papp, he was the first person will plant in Zionists' minds the idea of ethnic cleansing, to the point that Moshe Dayan would describe him as the first master. At that time, the gangs would start studying the geography of every Palestinian village and knowing its entrances and exits in preparation for storming it later, to be able to purify it. That's what Elon Papp calls the Village File Project. The European Jewish immigrants grew up, learned things, and had a trained military that can put plans. And there was a feeling that Britain is indeed an ally. But the war was hindering their interests in Palestine. Imagine. They limited the number of Jewish immigrants. Shame. At the time, the Zionists were divided. An opinion was led by David Ben-Gurion, who saw that he was against limiting the immigrations. But Britain was still an ally to Zionist plans. Oppositely, an opinion was led by the gangs of Argonne and Stern, that Britain, under the pressure of war and fear of tensions in the Arab region, has turned it into an obstacle in the way of the Zionist project. The tension reached its peak when the French Patria ship docked near Haifa port, and it had more than 1,800 Jewish immigrants without Britain's approval. That's when the Jewish gangs blew up one side of the ship and sacrificed 240 Jewish passengers to force British authorities to allow the rest of the 1,800 to enter. Someone will ask, so they blew up the ship and kill a part of the people they want in, to force Britain? My dear viewer, let me tell you that a chat happened between Stern and the Nazis, who went and met in Lebanon to form an alliance. Imagine that. The Nazis, who made concentration camps, holocausts, and a Jewish eradication in Europe. The Zionist Stern militia was trying to form an alliance with them. And they indeed met in Lebanon, just because they thought it would meet their interests. Again, this isn't me talking. This is Eugene Rogan's, the history and Middle East professor in Oxford University. The Zionist movement realized that Britain, after World War II, even if they won, would never be a great empire again. In her book Western Crime, Vivian Forrester says that all of Europe was in crisis during war, to the point that each country reduced the number of displaced Jews to it, and created what she called the Hitler trap. Hear that? European countries refused to refuge Jews, so they helped with the Holocaust. The Zionist movement realized that situation, and know that if they wanted a real ally, a new ally instead of Britain, then that ally has to be outside of Europe. Specifically, the United States of America. In 1942, Zionists held the Baltimore Conference to gather supporters of Zionism in America. Among its recommendations was that the New World System born after the war will have the Jewish country as a part of it, which is open to all the Jews of the world. That's when the Zionist movement was trying to have a role in the interests of the world's biggest empires. It provided itself as an ideal solution for the surplus of Jews in Europe. It also presented itself as a new ally to the single power that wasn't affected by war. That's when we ask, while America was in the midst of the Second World War, why did it accept the role of the new sponsor? Honestly, like I told you from that start, America is the most country in the world that can understand the Zionist dream. In her diary Hard Choices, the candidate Hillary Clinton says that the American people are mostly immigrants who fled their countries for a dream in a faraway country. Hillary says, we see our story in the story of Israel. It's true that the Americans won't be the holy and promised people, but at least they will be their allies, who will help them fulfill the dream they once achieved before. In addition to America's interests in having an ally like Israel, in a region like the Middle East. So, it's a win-win situation. And indeed, the new alliance was secured between the Zionist movements and the U.S., who would start to send funds, to the point that the Haganah would have armament factories. Of course, the British saw that and were shocked. They realized that the historic agreement between the British and Zionists was one-sided. It was a one-sided love, a toxic relationship. Britain kept on giving, and giving. Then you go hang out with America? Even when I needed you during World War II, and told you to please limit the Jewish immigrations, the Arabs gave me a headache. What did you do? And what about Stern, who met the Nazis? What's going on? Britain broke down, my friend. Britain was investing a lot in the Zionist project, to have a structure that served their interests in the area, to realize later that this wasn't an option in the Zionist plans. Britain was raising a monster, feeding it, and making it stronger, thinking that they have the monster's chain in their hands. But when they looked at the chain, they found no monster. The monster that they made was starting at the time some of the most violent waves of terrorism. Against who? The British themselves. In 1946, the Urgan Gang blew up the King David Hotel, the British administration headquarters. They blew it up with 200 kilos of bombs and killed 91 British persons. In 1947, the Irgun blew up the officers' club in Jerusalem. Then a ship named Exodus would arrive in Palestine, carrying 4,500 Holocaust survivors who wanted to enter Palestine. But the English refused. Guys, that's more than the allowed number. They sent the ship to France. Riots happened and 3 of the Irgun members were sentenced to death. So, the Irgun kidnapped 2 British soldiers and hung them dead in the fields of Netanya. In a clear message to the British: leave. We no longer need you. The paradox is that the Irgun leader, who was listed as wanted by Britain, was who? He was Menachem Begin. Listen to this. Menachem Begin, the future Prime Minister of Israel, who was given the Nobel Prize for Peace, was considered a terrorist by Britain. Just casually like that. Imagine a guy classified by Britain as a terrorist was given the Nobel Prize for Peace. During the final years of the British Mandate, 500 terrorist acts by the Jewish Zionists were documented, killing more than 169 British people, targeting banks and infrastructure, and using methods of terrorism that are new to the world. Like what? Like mined parcels. Put a bomb in a package, send it to someone, it blows up. Terrorism delivery. That's the innovation in terrorism. My dear viewer, this affected Britain so much that in England there were revenge attacks on 300 Jewish structures. Not just that, in addition to raising the Nazi swastika signs that encouraged the extermination of Jews. We are talking about England 2 years after World War II against Nazis. The British raised Nazi flags and signs. Guys, calm down. You shouldn't do that. You might think that the paradoxes are over. That the British power in Palestine at the time with 75,000 soldiers won't take any action against the Zionist gangs. They actually arrested over 300 Arabs on charges of carrying a weapon. Guys, are you blind? It wasn't us. The Israeli historian Avi Shlaim pointed at this paradox and said that the British Mandate carries the moral burden of preventing the establishment of a Palestinian state until the last minute. Until 1947, when Britain decides that this is it. They won't lose another soldier in the conflict. So, they tossed it to the United States and said, you take this. My back hurts. Eugene Rogan, an English historian, says something very surreal. That the country that says it battled the most terrorism kicked the British out with terrorism. Again, I'm not saying that. It's Mr. Eugene. Fifth myth, David and Goliath. The United Nations issued the Partition Resolution 181, dividing it into 6 regions. 3 Arab regions and 3 Jewish ones, with Jerusalem under international supervision. 56% of the land would go to the Jewish country. Most of the land would go to the Jews. Even though the number of Palestinians was double of the Jews. In 1947, the number of Palestinians was 1,200,000. And the number of Jews was 6,000. Palestinians legally owned, hear this part, 94% of the land and 80% of the agricultural land. So, bigger population, bigger land ownership. And in the end, it was divided 56% to the minority, who at the time only owned 6% of the land. The division gave Zionists bigger areas. But he couldn't give them ethnically unified cities. It gave them cities like Jaffa and Haifa, which are mostly Arabs. The historian Elon Papp said that no one in the world could have imagined that. a national liberation movement in Palestine, would share the land with its settlers. However, remember that the main goal of Zionism was for the Jews to not live with others that differ from them. And remember that the Zionist dream grew from a country in a part of Palestine to the entirety of Palestine. When General Darcy was asked about the situation in Palestine, he said that after Britain's leaving, the Jewish Agency controlled all of Palestine. The Haganah was an organized military group of 35,000 soldiers. The Palmach commands were more than 10,000 soldiers. Ergen and Stern were a big and organized military groups with experience. Meanwhile, the Arab front was far from being systematic or organized. The Arab countries had just survived war and an occupation that they were still healing from. With exhausted armies and conflicted interests, the Arab countries opened the doors to volunteering to save Palestine, to have an improvised army of 4,000 volunteers. That army was called the Arab Liberation Army. Despite the loyalty of its members, it still was an unorganized army. Even in Palestine, Elon Papp said that efforts were divided instead of united. Leaders like Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, Fawzi al-Qaji, and Hassan Salama carried out separate operations, but they would lose their effect. All of these were Arab and Palestinian attempts to reject the division. But on the Zionist side, a more dangerous event was happening. Remember, the declaration of Israel hasn't happened yet. Neither did the War of 1948. We are currently at the end of 1947, where intensive Haganah meetings were held. Remember the Villages Project, where they collected information about all Palestinian villages. It will change to the famous plan called Plan Dalit, a complete ethnic cleansing plan on paper ready to go. However, it needs a real trial or rehearsal. The rehearsal takes place on February 15 in 1948, when the Palmach fighter Yitzhak Rabin, who has a Nobel Prize for Peace by the way, led an attack on the village of Caesarea from Haifa district, expelling 1,500 of its inhabitants. The Zionists attacked 5 villages to ensure the efficiency of their fighters, and to make sure that the rest of the British soldiers, who haven't left yet, won't intervene. The gangs start an organized attack on the villages near Jerusalem. Someone asks, wasn't Jerusalem not a part of the divided areas? I just saw that map you showed me. One time, my friend, David Ben-Gurion, was asked about Israel's borders. He said that the best definition for Israel's borders are the farthest place that the Israeli soldiers can go. Since the beginning of the Zionist movement, it was movement that takes a piece of land and keeps expanding. I mean, why commit to borders that weren't here when we came? We created those ourselves. Everyday borders are created and changed. Yesterday we had 6%, now we have 55%. And if we move a bit, who knows what's next? Either way, with the right force, the world will accept it as a fact. This ideology controlled the Zionism movement from the beginning to now. In the beginning, the strategy was besieging every village they encounter from 3 sides, leaving only one exit, in order for the villagers to leave and be refugees somewhere else, where they will manage. However, sometimes these gangs would need to show off their power by leaving no exit for escape, like what happened in Deir Yassin on April 9, 1948. That's a quiet village with 700 people. It has farmers, merchants, a mosque, 2 schools, and a sports club. One day 250 people would be killed. almost third of the village. Each person would see his family die in front of his eyes, knowing that he's next, despite the fact that the British police office was only 3 kilometers away. But none of them did anything. A terrorist demonstration. This demonstration would push 75,000 Palestinians, leave their homes in Jaffa, Haifa, and Jerusalem and run away. The ethnic cleansing doesn't stop at expulsion and eradication, but also, like we have seen in the first story, it also means erasing any memory of that place. These victims were never here. 1 kilometer away from Deir Yassin, the Vashem Yad was built. Speaking of paradox, what is that? It's a Holocaust museum, proving the famous words by Emil Habibi, your Holocaust. Our catastrophe. While gangs took villages by force and terrorism, the British Mandate handed over the ports to the Jews as it left. They gave them 2,700 government buildings, 50 train stations, 3,000 km of roads, and 37 camps with filled weapons and spare parts. The British literally built them a country and left. According to the Zionist narrative, the crisis of the Palestinian refugees was caused by Arab armies calling citizens to move in preparation for armies to enter. However, the historian Elon Papp says that half the Palestinian refugees were expelled from their homes before the war. They were kicked out before May 1948, before the Arab armies even went in. Among the 530 villages destroyed in the Nakba, half of them were ethnically cleansed. Again, all that was before May 1948. The historian Avi Schlein confirms that the refugee crisis was born during the first half of 1948 and was not caused by the war itself. On May 14, 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel was announced. As part of the narrative, it announced itself as a young David in front of a giant Goliath, at a time when all the giants of the world or the great powers recognized it very quickly. So much that for a country like America, President Harry Truman recognized the country after only 11 minutes. The very next day on May 15, 1948, Arab armies would announce going to war. And the New York Times title was, "Jews in Grave Danger in All Muslim Lands." If you look at that title, it hints at the idea of the Holocaust. That country had a ready-to-go propaganda. One day after it was created, one of the biggest newspapers wrote that. And while the title suggests a Jewish minority facing a huge tide of Muslims' armies, if we look a bit closer, we would find that the entire 7 Arab armies were very small in number. They were around 25,000 soldiers. Let me remind you that these armies weren't as organized as we think. These were armies that still had some countries under occupation. On the other side, the Jewish army started the war with 35,000 soldiers. At the end of the war, they were 100,000. Someone who hasn't watched the episode I'm talking about might think that the Arab countries were organized armies that lost in front of a group of gangs. However, after watching this entire episode, now you know that these weren't just some gangs. These people were trained with the British, participated in World War II, have been in operations, have funding, have been fighting for years. And Western countries gave them fully weaponized military camps. In addition, Arab armies saw them as gangs and didn't think about all the other factors. That's why Arabs were shocked by defeat. How was a group of organized armies defeated by a bunch of gangs? But like we have said, They weren't gangs. They were armed forces who did massacres during war. Like bombing Lod and Ramla, and the Tantura massacre that we talked about. According to Elon Papp, massacres were no longer done when it was necessary, or even as a part of a certain strategy. They happened just because they can. Or as he described, Zionists can no longer see that they are killing humans. In August 1948, after the defeat of the Arab armies, an expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees to surrounding countries, Count Bernadotte, the UN ambassador, visited Palestine and refugee camps in Jordan. He was terrified by what he saw. He said, "It would be an insult to the principles of justice to deprive these innocent victims of the right to return to their homes." Yes, finally the UN talks, the international law. Unfortunately, a plot twist, the Count will die. A car accident, ABO homed? No, an assassination. The Stern gang assassinated him, with the participation of Yitzhak Shamir, who will be as usual the Prime Minister of Israel. It's like it's the requirements of the position. By December 1948, the Jews will occupy 85% of Jerusalem, outside the Old City in front of the eyes of the UN. The Israeli historian, Hillel Cohen, said that thousands of refugees from Sepphoris and the surrounding villages took shelter in the Christian city of Nazareth. Ben-Gurion feared of destroying it, knowing its importance in the Christian world. It's the city of Jesus. Thanks, I guess. These thousands of refugees made a nucleus for the 1948 Arabs, the Palestinians inside the new state to be established. The Jewish gangs tried to attract the Christians of villages like Al-Bassa to return, but without the Muslims. Why? To establish the idea of safe Christian villages, and affirm that they were in a defensive war with the Muslim Arabs. But the Palestinian Christians of Al-Bassa refused to return without the Palestinian Muslims. On December 11, the UN issued Resolution 194, guaranteeing the right of return for every refugee who was expelled. How many refugees were they, ABO homed? How many were expelled in the Nakba? 750,000 refugees. And that was in 1948. After 75 years, they became 5 million refugees. The Argentinian researcher Pedro Brieger, during his visit to refugee camps after decades of the Nakba, said all children introduced themselves with names of the villages that their ancestors were from. This child knows nothing about the village except its name. He never visited nor saw it, but introduces us from it. He still has the key of his grandparents' house that they were kicked from. Generations would still pass on these keys, one to another. The right of return that the UN granted the Palestinians. As you know, it was never implemented. But in 1950, Israel announced the right of return. That any Jew has the right to return to Israel. Israel that represents the extension of the Jewish state. After the Roman invasion in 70 BC, 2,000 years ago. It's ironic that why would someone who never lived on this land has the right to return to it, while someone who actually lived on the land doesn't have the right to return? The only condition for Israel's return law is to have a Jewish mother. Imagine a Jewish Russian. His grandparents for 20 generations lived, died, and got buried in Russia. He would get the right to return, go to Israel, get the citizenship, a passport, and all his rights once he steps off that plane. On the other hand, at the West Bank, there's the Jordan River. That is Palestine to its left and Jordan to its right. There's a Palestinian refugee in Jordan standing on the side of the river, looking at Palestine's land on the other side, his and his grandparents' land, but can't pass the river to it. The law of return of the Jews is an embodiment of a Herzl-originated idea, freeing the Jews from all their diaspora and create a pure race society. A society just for them. They create its boundaries and cancel the others, whether by avoidance, expulsion, or genocide. By the time of the peace treaty in July 1949, the Zionist forces didn't just take over 55% of the land as to the partition resolution, but 78% from the land. The UN recognized these new borders and called them the Green Line. The Israeli historian, Theodore Katz, whom we spoke of early on, the one with the masters in Tantura, said that the morality of the IDF lives on an eternal fallacy, because they didn't come to a land without people, but to a land with 1.3 million Palestinians there. But they weren't humans in the eyes of the Israeli army. This is probably the way that new generations in Israel will inherit the fictional legend. A group of psychological defense mechanisms, denial and justification, to help them sleep at night and forget that buried in this land. Just a meter down, all the possible evidence on the killing, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. What happened in Tantura happened in all Palestinian land. Last myth, the only democracy in the Middle East. In 1948, Ben-Gurion, the immigrant who spent his youth in Poland, said that not only did he achieve the dream, but he's also its founder, or how the Jews named him, the state's main founder. A dream described as a 100% Jewish country without Arabs. A completely pure society for Jews only. And if any Palestinian tried to disturb the dream, he would face the fate of Jerusalem and Haifa. Destroyed villages, ports wiped out by bombing. Streets filled with thousands of Palestinian corpses. Those who were lucky were expelled and lived as refugees all their lives. The slogan raised by the Zionist movement: a land without a people for a people without a land. For the entirety of our tale was an absolute slogan that doesn't accept bargaining or any presence of the other. It's either us or them. A slogan that the Zionists adhered to, even when Arabs represented 70% of the population and 90% of the place. 75 years after Ben-Gurion's declaring the achievement of the dream, the Jewish community still maintains its purity equation. No matter the consequence and price. The community includes Israeli Jews who have the privileges, and Palestinians suffer from discrimination on all levels. A society summed up by its current leader, Benjamin Netanyahu. Israel is not a state of all its citizens, but rather the nation-state of the Jewish people and only them. If you are an Arab living on the historical land of Palestine, your life will be determined from the beginning by where you are. We will divide it into 3 categories. The 48 Palestinians, West Bank Palestinians, and Palestinians of Gaza. The 48 Palestinians are 2 million Palestinians with the Israeli citizenship. They alone constitute 20% of the country. But they are second-class citizens. You'll get fewer years of education than your fellow Israeli citizen, because the Arabic spoken by 2 million people is not officially recognized. No matter how high of a rank you get at work, your monthly income is less than the average Israeli citizen. If you decided it doesn't matter, I'll focus only on my life and my family. Unfortunately, you aren't allowed to request citizenship for your family outside Israel. Even if you decided to forget your origin, and become a Jewish. According to the Israeli law, you're not allowed to do that. Or at least you'll face many obstacles to make sure it's nearly impossible. A hard life, huh? Let me tell you that this is considered luckier than Palestinians in the West Bank. There are 2.7 million Palestinians living in the West Bank, under the direct Israeli occupation. But they live in a prison-like structure, with sectors of locked gates. And moving from a sector or a prison to another requires passing through numerous military checkpoints. On the one street you live in, there could be tens of checkpoints, turning a 5-minute walk to an hours-long inspection. With all that, you're surrounded by more than 130 settlements. Illegal, of course. These settlements are housed by 500,000 settlers. Between 2017 and 2021, the Israeli army gave 33 permits for the Palestinians to build houses, while on the other hand the Israeli army demolished over 1,150 homes and gave the illegal settlers 1,100 building permits. The Palestinian whose home is demolished, with nowhere to go, can't even put up a tent, without getting a permit from the Israeli army that he certainly doesn't get. Where do we go? We don't know, figure it out. They really tightened the tap on them. The truth is they didn't just tighten it metaphorically, they did it literally. Water, which is a basic right for any human, gets delivered to the settler with a capacity of 300 liters per day, while the Palestinian waits for water to fill his tank every 15 days. From the Israeli government and companies. And his daily capacity doesn't exceed 80 liters per day, which is less than the 100 liters specified by the WHO. That's not a water shortage, but an intended discrimination in distribution between the Palestinian and Israeli. If you live in Gaza, your response would be, wait, you guys have water? In Gaza, 2 million people live on an area of 360 square kilometers. No barriers, no gates, as the entire strip is fully besieged. It is not connected to the world by a port, airport, or trains. Nothing can enter or leave it without permission of the Israeli army. Some sources say that the Israeli army controls the amount of calories that enter to the citizens inside the strip. They calculate the amount of food entering to the number of people for the calories intake. Most of the strip's land is not suitable for farming. Its groundwater is polluted, 90% of it is not suitable for human consumption, or even to grow food. Hello my dear viewers. Imagine with me for a moment that you are a seagull. Seagull flying over the Mediterranean Sea to the east, until you reach a point on the coast between Tel Aviv and Haifa. There you will find a charming and beautiful place known today as Dor. An ideal resort no less wonderful than the beaches of Greece, Cyprus, and Sicily. Soft sand, nice atmosphere, and coral reefs. Greenery around and beyond the beach. A museum and some archaeological sites that date back to the Bronze Age. And many houses that if you see them, you feel that they came from Florida and were stationed here. Of course, there are many resorts around with various services and facilities. Since you're still a seagull who knows nothing about the place, you'll see a modern resort from the sky, called Nashalim. A few meters away from it, there's a small building, of a style different from that of the surrounding place. And it doesn't really fit in with the harmony of it. A house built in an old Arab style standing in the heart of many Western and modern style buildings. In 1991, a resident of that place decided to build a diving center next to this house. And indeed, Workers and equipment arrived at the location and the drilling began. But they suddenly stopped, as they found the remains of human bones buried at a shallow depth. So, they closed everything up, left and never came back again. This was seen by a fisherman named Fawad Hasadaya, who lives in the nearby Arab village of Al-Faratis. When he went to the project owner and asked him why they left, the project manager told him, "We found bones and remains from Napoleon's age." But Fawad says, "No. These are the remains of Palestinians who were killed in 1948 and were buried there." His father and grandfather told him about the massacre committed by Israeli soldiers in this place, and that the dead were buried in mass graves. One of these graves lies beneath the parking lot of that Nashalem resort. All of this happened before the resort was built, and before the place was even renamed as Dor. It happened when it was a Palestinian fishing village called Tantura. Tantura was a small Palestinian village, located at the south of Haifa on the map. Until 1948, its population was about 1,500 Palestinians, who depended on fishing and farming. 80% of the population's food depends on international aid. There's not even constant electricity, to have you see the depressing conditions. Gaza's need for electricity is 560 megawatts, and it only receives no more than 200 megawatts. In an environment like this, there are 50% unemployment. Although children make up the majority of the people in Gaza, most of the strip schools were destroyed. Even though Israel doesn't militarily occupy Gaza, it turned it into a large open-air prison, and only it who has the key. The International Committee of the Red Cross considers the situation to be a complete violation of the Geneva Conventions. According to the Israeli academic Oren Yiftichel, Israel is an ethnocracy, a country that only serves Jews, a system that works for the Jewish majority, with a goal to harm the Arab minority, a system to confirm its purity and identity. This won't happen without inflicting severe damage to others living with it. Israel is an apartheid state. These aren't my words, but those of Noam Chomsky, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the Israeli Minister of Education himself. Israel is an apartheid state. All what I said throughout the episode since Zionism was just an idea, until this moment here and now, says that apartheid is the expected development of the original idea. That identity will determine people's rights, and that because of the Palestinians' identity, they'd be robbed of their rights. A world that we wish it ends soon, and that Palestinians would get their rights as humans and Palestinians. We tried together to understand the roots of this reality, and understand how the story originated, developed, and got complexed. Maybe when we understand this dreadful reality, we have the imagination to paint a picture of a better reality. That's what makes us human at the end. It was a very quiet, very small, and very, very beautiful village. After the Nakba and for 50 years, until approximately the year 2000. Nothing was said about Tantura, in Israel, other than being a village that witnessed a battle in the War of Independence between the Israelis and Arabs. And the Israelis won, and the Arabs immigrated from the village and went to the nearby village of Al-Faratis. And then the settlers established Kibbutz Nashalem there. That remained the situation until 1998. When an Israeli student at the University of Haifa published his master's thesis. This student was called Teddy Katz. While preparing his research, he met a number of old soldiers. Soldiers from a military brigade of the Israeli army called the Alexandroni Brigade. They were the ones responsible for entering Tantura on May 22, 1948. With their testimonies, Katz discovered that the battle was not actually a real battle. It wasn't a battle between two armies or two armed parties, because despite the villagers' attempts to resist, they were poorly armed and had little experience in fighting. So the battle ended before it even started. The family's surrender after their defeat wasn't an escape from death. It was, in fact, the beginning of a massacre. On the night of May 22nd and the morning of the 23rd, Israeli soldiers invaded the village of Tantura. At first, they separated men and women. Women were stripped of their money, gold, and anything of value. They were expelled from the village, wandering in the unknown with no place to go. As for the village's men, the soldiers gathered them on the beach, near the Arab house. Don't think this only applied to real grown-up men, but any boy who looked over 13 years old was considered an adult man. By the Arab house, the witness of these events, execution began. The testimonies that Teddy Katz heard from the soldiers were terrifying, and were later shown combined in a movie called Tantura, by an Israeli director named Alon Swartz.